right? Isn't that what you would do, what you should do as a good Darwinist, right? You have to protect the long-term interests of our community. Our communities require a lot of farm-raised stuff, right? And we can't raise stuff on farms if they're of course, they weren't around here. I think they were always east of the Rocky Mountains. Maybe sometimes they came over here. I don't know. I don't know enough about them, but Washington, D.C., I guess, was prime habitat for passenger pigeons. But you see where we're going now, okay? And you see how perhaps the neo-Kantians are raising a very important point and a very important objection that we ought to take seriously. That if Darwin's account of the origin of morality is all there is to it, right? It's a biological phenomenon. Morality is a biological phenomenon that originates in some animal communities, in almost all mammal communities, in order to ensure, because almost all mammals are highly social animals that require cooperation in order to provide for themselves and their future, right? And so morality emerges in order to protect the long-term interests of human beings, right? And so by golly, morality instructed us to kill all the passenger pigeons. And we're not only is that morally permissible, but it was morally obligatory for our ancestors to do that, right? And then we could leave it at that. And then Leopold's essay right there should end, right? The farmers would ultimately have been obliged in self-defense to do so. Perhaps this is true. But perhaps it is also true that we did away with an idea, a cultural artifact, right? Not a biological artifact, a cultural artifact. We did away with an idea as well as a bird. It is one of the ironies of science that it discovers ex post facto a philosophical significance in what it has previously tossed into the dustbin. So, is the fact that the pigeon is the instantiation, the manifestation of this really important idea, as Leopold calls it, enough to persuade our ancestors that perhaps they ought not eliminate the passenger pigeons, even though doing so is necessary, very important for our agricultural interests, right? That seems to be what Leopold is saying. That because the idea of this bird is so significant, there's so much meaning, so much ecological, biological, and even human historical meaning wrapped up in this bird, that we had obligations, our ancestors have obligations, which they abrogated. They didn't live up to their obligations. The pigeon was no mere bird. He was a biological storm. He was the lightning that played between two biotic poles of intolerable intensity, the fat of the land and his own zest for living. Yearly the feathered tempest roared up, down, and across the continent, sucking up the laden fruits of forest and prairie, burning them in a traveling blast of life. Anyway, all right. So, the advantage of Collicutt's theory of Leopold, the advantage of Collicutt's reconstruction of the land ethic is that it roots the land ethic in sentiment, right? And perhaps it gives us then more motivation. But it also doesn't explain how we can have sentimental attachments to ecological wholes. That's where the biophile can step in perhaps and say, okay, that's how you can have sentimental attachments, through biophilia. But that's a very speculative kind of hypothesis. And perhaps it makes a great deal more sense just to say, as Rolston does, that we humans have the capability to understand the intrinsic values of ecological wholes, and that understanding itself brings with it certain responsibilities, right? The more you understand, the more responsible you are. That kind of goes without saying, doesn't it? Maybe that's why some people don't want to understand. Right? They know that responsibility comes with understanding, and so they don't really want to understand. Rolston's position is best characterized as deontological ecocentrism. Okay, enough of that. We've already been through this stuff. All right. So, are we persuaded? I don't know. What am I supposed to ask you guys now? Are we supposed to get into heavy philosophical stuff for the people who aren't even paying attention? Or are we supposed to just always go back, put on our Smokey Bear hats and say, okay, what's the rule here? I could make this class so much more challenging. College is supposed to be hard, right? But I make it easy because I always come back to land management problems, right? But there are these fascinating and very important conflicts, philosophical conflicts going on that I'm asking you to pay attention to and to think about. And not enough of you did on the midterm, not even close, all right? Did not begin to think about the philosophical issues that I invited you to think about, okay? So tighten up the ship. So, I mean, let's consider this. Do we have binding moral obligations to preserve and protect the integrity and stability of Earth's climate systems? Does anybody answer that? No. Okay? Nobody answers that no, not even the people who are surfing the net in the back of the room and who pissed me off. Are you surfing the net? Okay. You're doing what?
Looking at the PowerPoint.
Not you, man, back there. You're looking at the PowerPoints? Okay, I'm sorry. I really am. I don't mean to pick on anybody, all right? It's just, when I get the sense that people aren't getting it, then I sometimes begin to suspect you're just not trying, or you don't have enough time. Okay, so it's almost as though Rolston gives us this, it's a non-consequentialist argument, right? And so he commits us to the view that we have hard and fast obligations to maintain the integrity of ecological communities, right? And then you might ask, well, what about all those instances where our obligations to humans conflict with our obligations to to ecological wholes? And that's where things really get difficult, right? And Rolston has addressed that question. Rolston he kind of articulated and then defended his own meta-ethical perspective throughout the 80s and 90s, right? And then he kind of realized that, there's not much more you can do meta-ethically. And at that point, he started turning his attention to social ecology. And he's written a lot of stuff in the last 10 years or 10 or 15 years or so. And he's actually served on international committees. He's been invited to serve on committees of the United Nations. And so he's turned his attention to politics, on real-life, practical, prudential considerations. And he admits, he has to, right, that what he's arguing for in an essay like this is a position that often comes into conflict, especially in impoverished countries. Preservation of species in an impoverished country has dramatic consequences for a lot of people, right? Because a lot of people in impoverished countries live in areas, where you can't just make a national park, right? You can't just make a national park in India, for example, without displacing usually hundreds of thousands of people, right? And so if you want to save, some endangered subspecies of leopard that lives in some remote area in India, it's not really remote, right? There's no remote place in India. So our humanitarian obligations, right, and the needs of impoverished people are in real life situations often in conflict with species preservation, right? And Rolston has struggled with this, right, and has tried to come up with principles that can mediate between the vital needs of species and the vital needs of humans. And ultimately, Rolston really kind of begins at the end of his career, begins to sound like a social ecologist, because he recognizes that we cannot really be serious about preserving species as long as we have, like the video of the last male black rhino. I didn't quite catch his name, but he's an endling too, right? And they guard him. They hacked off his horn. That video that we saw during break was a few years old already, but more recently they've completely removed everything. And he's really odd looking now, but he's surrounded 24/7 by soldiers, right? By armed soldiers, 24/7. Because poachers, even the last one, a poacher might, and that's why they had to cut off his horn, right? To prevent people from being tempted. All right. Anyway, so we might think about some of these other philosophical questions, and then these last three slides or so are old kind of review slides. You can remember biocentrism isn't totally on board with the idea that ecological wholes have any kind of status at all, right? Anyway, I kind of feel like just Well, what do you guys want to do? Are there endangered species that we should focus on? Should we go back to the passenger pigeon? Should we pursue that line of questioning? How do we explain? How can you justify the claim that extinction of the passenger pigeons was a moral wrong, a moral travesty? It used the strongest possible language, right, that many environmentalists would use. When I sit around and talk to my family about this stuff, we use very strong language, right? Because we're all we care about stuff like that. Maybe you guys don't, some of you don't think, that it's that big of a deal. But how would you justify the claim that extinction of passenger pigeons is morally wrong in light of the fact that extinction seems to have been necessary for expansion of agriculture in North America? What are our obligations? What were the obligations of our ancestors? Yes?
Well, just to break it down to the simplest terms, it's going back to the fact that they're putting human interests in front of the interests of other species. And I think that's something that Rolston kind of touched on at the end of the article that we all just read for our reading summary. It was the last paragraph. Really, I don't know if anybody else felt the same way, but really stuck with me because it really summarized what we're talking about.
There is something Newtonian, not yet Einsteinian, besides something morally naive about living in a reference frame where one species takes itself as absolute and values everything else relative to its utility. That's what you're referring to. But, okay, yeah, so that's one answer. Human vital needs were not really at stake. And human vital needs, there were no vital needs which would have been compromised. There were no vital human needs that would have been compromised by the measures that we would have had to have taken in order to ensure the ongoing survival of these birds in great numbers. They have to have great numbers from what I could tell. They kind of, when the numbers got below a certain point, they just couldn't make it. So anyway, we're talking about setting aside huge areas of North America for them to do their thing, right? And you're saying doing that was not inconsistent with human vital needs, and therefore it was wrong. If it had been if it had really been in conflict with human vital needs, then doing it would have been okay. And I guess that was the part that I was trying to draw out of Leopold's speech at the dedication of the Pigeon Monument, right? Where he says that if the meat hunters and the people who cleared their roosting areas hadn't done what they did, which was what caused them to collapse, then the farmers eventually would have had to shoot them all because of vital human needs, I think is what Leopold was suggesting, right? But evidently, Leopold is also trying to say that consequences to human communities have to be tempered with recognition of the rights of ongoing existence of species, right? And that's a non-consequentialist argument, though, right? And that's where Rolston might step in and say, aha, this is Leopold couldn't quite articulate it because he was still tied up with all this Darwinist stuff, right? And Darwinism is accurate as far as an account of biological evolution, but moral evolution is a cultural phenomenon. And culturally, we have come to recognize that doubt, right? That doubt that Leopold refers to, culturally, we've come to recognize that the trade-off of consequences that our ancestors thought we were okay with that, right? There's a good trade-off here, right? We're benefiting ourselves by eliminating these birds. Now we doubt that, right? And why do we doubt it? Because the birds, even though, yeah, sure, we're better off, economically, we're better off without them, right? Economically, we're better off without the passenger pigeons. Are we done then? Okay, class dismissed. Right? We know what the right answer is. Just check that on your multiple choice exam.
What I have a difficulty with is it says that the passenger pigeon was a biological storm and that's why they were destroyed. But in all reality, humans are also a biological storm. We go through and we storm through everything. But I also feel like it's contradicting because there seems to be like this evolution split between our own species, where we have healers and we have destroyers. And then taking it back to the first essay, it's, I don't know. I just think it's contradicting and morally wrong. Yeah, definitely. Because if it was morally right, then we should kill ourselves. in all reality, because we're just equal to that. We are biological storms.
We're exotic invasive biological storms, which is way worse than the passenger pigeons.
Well, yeah, and then Ralston also, I'm sorry, I'll get it.
Go ahead, yeah.
But I mean, Ralston also was saying, they're saying his exception was organisms of disease. But we are also an organism of disease.
Mm-hmm.
We carry, we transfer.
Yes. Yes.
And so that, I don't know exactly.
So in the final analysis, though, we have to balance out our humanitarian concerns, which we just have, right? You don't want to put Edward Abbey in charge of litter patrol, right? Because he'll be posting snipers on all the bridges, you know, just bam, you litter, you're dead, right? And just massively reduce this human disease population, right? That is swarming over all of the other parts of the earth and killing them, right? But no, that's once you start thinking that way, then maybe you get accused of being an eco-fascist, right?
Exactly.
And so in a way, Collicutt was doing something very important by trying to point out that our obligations toward our fellow community members are still really important, and they sometimes supersede our obligations to ecological wholes, right? We just have these obligations to one another, and part of living a good life is to be kind and loving and protective of one another, right? And so to promote a position, a policy view that implies that you should be harming your fellow human beings, that can't be right either, right? But consequentially, that may, you know, I mean, consequentially, it certainly would be good for the earth to reduce the human population fairly dramatically. But in the meantime, maybe our project is to live lives of personal excellence and not to achieve a certain consequence. That's one thing you can take away from this class in the final analysis, I hope, is that, you know, even setting aside consequentialist thinking, we have an obligation to live harmoniously. And even if we, you know, it's so difficult collectively because there's so many of us to live in harmony with the natural world, we can't just violate our duties to one another either, you know. So it's a pretty messy situation that we find ourselves in because, you know, especially like I was saying, in impoverished parts of the world, these questions about resource conservation are much more impactful. You know, the effort to preserve wildlife in India has much more consequences because here we can just preserve wildlife in places where we don't live, right? But in India, people live everywhere, and that's how most of the world is. There are people just everywhere, and so, and many of them are using resources in a sustainable way. You know, they're using the forest to get wood products and to get some food, right? To get herbs and stuff, and so to expel them in order to create a national park to protect a certain subspecies of leopard or something there seems something deeply morally wrong about that. You know. If it's necessary to protect the leopard, then, you know, I don't know. But obviously we have to address all these issues at the same time, including overpopulation, including overconsumption, which is really much worse than overpopulation, right? The people of the north look at the south and say, you guys are all overpopulating, you're just swarming with humans, you need to knock it off. And they up from down there, they look at us, right? And they say, you guys are overconsuming. Look at how much stuff you use up and how much pollution you produce. You know, you use like 40% of the world's fossil fuels, and you're only 5% of the world's population. So overconsumption probably has a more significant effect, you know, on ecological wholes than just overpopulation. But we need to address them all at the same time, and that's what Ralston is saying, I think. But he's saying that we can't address environmental issues without recognizing the profound layers of value that are manifesting themselves there, right? You can't just manage for human beings because there are all kinds of other values happening. All right. So anybody else? Passenger pigeons? Still have thoughts about those guys?
Discussed. You got angry last time about what were we talking about? Genetically manufacturing another passenger pigeon because we wouldn't be able to sustain them.
I didn't get angry. I just recognized that the focus on techno fixes without without cultural transformation
Yeah.
is kind of a dead end. I'm not opposed to,
But just for that species, or just in general, anything?
well, what are we going to do with the passenger pigeon once we've recreated her in the laboratory?
At least try to restart the population.
Uh-huh.
I mean, there's an attempt. I mean, that's my moral reasoning, is you have to at least try to do something.
Yeah.
That's the start of it.
Yeah, you're right.
If people aren't willing to change their ways, then who's to say they're just not going to kill them all?
But you have to be that first person to start changing your way and attempting that. If everyone just says, oh, well, it's never going to happen, then
Yeah,
not
it just
even
has to be
taking-
like.
I guess, look, I have this concern that reliance on techno fixes distracts us from the real work that we need to do as a culture. And so I am going to be suspicious of any kind of techno fix to anthropogenic climate destabilization, any kind of techno fix to biodiversity loss, right? That's all. I'm in favor of trying to bring back extinct species. But I'm very skeptical about whether that attempt is ever going to be anything more than the well-funded pet project of somebody who's kind of not really working in the real world, Yeah, Kevin has his hand up.
I think it's a good idea if we have that ability to genetically bring back a species, but I think that also creates sort of a safety net. Because if we disregard, if we have this technology now, let's not worry about that type of species going extinct, because if 30 years from now we figure out, we might actually need that species, we can just bring it back. So it kind of disregards your concern for any species that's going extinct.
Yeah. Yeah. Synthetic meat's another interesting subject. Growing meat, without any animals at all in a laboratory. Yeah.
So what I think, like what you're trying to say with the passing vision and climate change and all of that, is that if we just make something that keeps the current system as it is, and just no, we can have it both, but the bigger problems from the way that led us to these crashes at these places and the destabilization of climate, those problems will still be there and they'll still be progressing because we're still in that mind frame. You can't just, it's like putting a bandage over this gaping, bleeding wound. It's it's going to appear to fix it for now, but there will be problems down the line because it's not actually fixed. It's very surface.
Yes.
Is the concern, and I agree on that. And then it's important, and you should certainly be able to bring back a species, but there's greater systemic problems that would just lead us down whole new routes of bad things happening.
Yeah.
While you're bandaging the wound, you still have to disinfect it, and having that bandage there keeps things still intact rather than not intact.
There you go.
Say things eventually start going majorly downhill, and unless we start putting populations in, even artificially.
But it's where would they go? There's it's they need big populations. The pigeons need big populations to exist, and there are no places for them to go. So it's that's just
I'm not saying pigeon necessarily, but
yeah, no.
when we go down that slope, and having that technology and testing those ideas already is going to lend into that down the road, if that does happen. I mean, we don't want to be to the point where we just have to be like, okay, it's over.
No.
No, that's not what I'm saying. It's yes, we need that. We need to be able to bring the boats back, but that's just the surface concerns. There's bigger things. It's yes, make that technology available and certainly make it work, but that's not going to make it so that suddenly these species can just flourish.
Right.
Yeah.
Do our obligations to recover endangered species increase the more evident it is that human actions caused? Well, that's one thing Rolston seems to be arguing, isn't it? That seems to be an essential part of his argument, that when humans caused the extinction, we have an obligation to do something to prevent it, right, if we're causing it. Example, you had your hand up for a while there.
Yeah, I was going to talk about, too, how when we were talking about bringing back animals, if we were able to even do that, it's not, we're just bringing back, the life of the animal. Well, he said last class the culture behind how the animal will live and where it'll be and everything like that is still gone. So we're just it's like you're creating a body without anything and starting that from nothing is strange. Also with
Yeah, it's still fragmentary, right? It reinforces this fragmented view of the natural world as consisting of a series of nuts and bolts and rivets, you know? And we want to now we want to fashion some new rivets that are similar, you know, they're supposedly identical to the ones before. But anyway, and that's good. That's part of it, right? And that's good that people are talking about that. And hopefully it'll inspire us to do the cultural work and the holistic ecological work that we need to do in order to actually make this happen. But though someone once pointed out about the California condor, and I think this is true of every species, really. He said the California condor is 95% place and only 5% feathers and bones and meat and stuff. Right? And that's how all species are. They have their little niche in the environment, and if that environment isn't there, then the species isn't going to make it.
also with bringing back animals to life, it's like you're only addressing like the symptom, not the main cause of why they're even gone to begin with. So it's not, as he was saying, it's like a safe net.
Yeah.
It's not fixing anything to bring them back. It's like, it's not like we're turning on a light switch and turning it back off. With turning on that light switch, you lose all that energy. Turning it off, the energy is gone forever.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
A few articles ago, when we were doing a summary, one of the articles, it was talking about how basically the balance is our standard of living compared to like animals now, and that's basically the main cause of it. We can't just take over everything. We're gonna and bring back life to kingdoms to put them anywhere else. There's no more like land to give the animals to.
Yeah. All right. Yes, Rose.
I wanted to say two things. One, throughout the readings, I've noticed that there is a distinction between human community and human economy, and I feel like it's primarily the latter that causes problems, not the former.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, I don't think anything's going to change until this particular form of economy goes away, which, good luck.
Well, that's a social ecology thesis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The second thing I wanted to say on the topic of techno fixes is I don't even think that's something that should even be on the table, because we have shown that we don't know what we're doing, at all with this. A very good example is the genetically modified mosquitoes in Brazil that are now spreading the Zika virus, because this company released millions of mosquitoes in order to wipe out this other set of mosquitoes that was causing this other virus. Unfortunately, they turned out to be carriers of Zika virus. And they're not dying because there's tetracycline in the environment everywhere from pesticides.
Wow.
So that's where that whole thing came from. And that's like that's a prime example of trying to modify a
Fascinating.
population and it just screwing up massively.
So do people who have contracted this Zika virus now have a tort claim against this company that released these mosquitoes?
There have been 3,000 cases since October, and this virus has been around since 1947, and there have been less than 3,000 known in the 60s, 80 years that it's been out. So I don't know what's going to happen now.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if the pharmaceutical company that did all this stuff with the mosquitoes and genetically modifying them doesn't have some kind of a exemption and can't be sued, right? To their friends in Congress set it up like that, so they can't be sued for when they screw up so horribly like that. That would bankrupt them, right?
Well, wouldn't you have to blame the people that put the tetracycline in first? If they have to do that and then result to the next thing, you have to go down, or you have to go up the ladder and see who put it there first.
Yeah, I guess so.
And that just makes it a big mess.
Mm-hmm. All right, so we don't know what we're doing genetically. We shouldn't be doing that. But what was your first point?
About the economy versus community.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the economy versus the community. Yeah, I mean, I can play endlessly on the Greek roots of the words economy and ecology. I've already done that a few times this term. But we live in a culture that has been worshiping economic growth for a couple hundred years at least, and it's intensified in the last 40 or 50 years particularly, this worship of economic growth. And it's astonishing. I mean, one might view our culture as somewhat insane to the extent that when the leaders of our country are confronted with evidence that mainstream economic practices are fundamentally incompatible with the ongoing health of our ecosystem and of our planet, of our air, our water, they double down. And instead of adjusting the economy to accommodate the ecology, they just deny that those effects, right? And they deny science. They become science deniers in order to continue rationalizing treating economic interests as more important than everything else, right? So even when we know our study of the home, right? Oikos is home. The Greek word for home, nomos means rule, right? So economy, ekos nomos, is the rules of the home, right? And ekos logos is the study of the home. And so what's happened in the last 100 years or so with the emergence of ecology is we've studied the home and we've concluded that many of these practices that we do routinely in order for utilitarian reasons to benefit ourselves and our future and our descendants, right? Many of these things that we do routinely are inconsistent, right? That's what logos oikos, studying the home, teaches us, right? And yet we continue bowing down to the economy. Why? Because the lords of the economy want to maintain their power and wealth, right? And so they want us to continue. It's not like they can make us think this way, but the whole economy is organized. In a way, you could say the entire occupation of North America by European peoples is predicated on the idea of that labor and natural resources can be readily and freely exploited by people, who have power. And now, and then Leopold comes along and says it's time to stop thinking that way. Stop thinking of ourselves as conquerors of the land and start thinking of ourselves as plain citizens of the land, fellow members of the biotic community. And because of what we know about ecology, right? We have to make the ecology more important than the economy. And that goes against the American way, doesn't it? That's what we're taught to believe. But actually, the American way is more about a community than it is about the economy, isn't it? What is the American way? I go so far as to make the provocative claim that socialism is what made our country great. People don't like to acknowledge. I don't know why. What's wrong with that? I mean, isn't it true though? Social security. Our elders, our grandparents were eating cat food and stuff like that, because they couldn't afford before we implemented a social safety net for our elders, right, called Social Security. And if that isn't socialism, I don't know what is, right? Public schools, public fire departments, national parks, state parks, county parks, wilderness refuges, and Malheur, right? These are all socialist institutions. And socialism has that word social right in it, right? Not like capitalism. All capitalism has in it is capital, right? Capitalism